My friend's mother was a wonderful quilter. Unfortunately, she is no longer with us, but she has left behind some beautiful works of art, to include a cathedral window that won a blue ribbon at the Tennessee State Fair. This quilt is proudly hung on display in my friend's home, and when I visit, I love to stand in front of it and kind of take in all of the movement, the shapes, and the colors. It just inspires me and drives me to want to make one of my own. It's been one that's been on my bucket list for a while, but I've always been intimidated to try it because it looks tedious, it looks complicated, and I wasn't sure I was up for the challenge. But in today's video, all of that changes because I can and I will, watch me, make a cathedral window. Hey friends, welcome back to my sewing room. Today I've got a tutorial video for you where I'm going to walk you through step by step how I made this very beautiful cathedral window quilt. Now this is a smaller quilt, probably better for a wall hanging, that measures 19¼ inches tall by 16¼ inches wide, and I am in love. I'm going to tell you, this quilt took me a very long time to put together. The culmination of the quilt in the video took me about 3 months. Now that was me setting it down, picking it up, setting it down, picking it up. So there's not been constant movement on the project over the course of those 3 months, but it is a labor intensive project. So keep that in mind. Also, I will let you know that I don't think this is a beginner-friendly project. I think it's probably more like an intermediate level, just because of the curved quilting that will have to happen as you go. But if you're up for the challenge, I think everything else about putting this together is relatively easy. Now, there are a number of different ways that you can do a cathedral window, and some of them are easier than others. And I am sure that if this method doesn't work for you, you will find a video tutorial for you on YouTube that does make it easier for you to do. But this video is how I tackled this quilt. So let's get right to the content. I'm going to show you how I build this out in just a moment, but before we do, I want to talk about the tools that I'm using because I know these questions will come up. The first notion that I'm using that makes this a whole lot easier is fabric glue. Personally, I am using the Precision Piecing Products Seam Align Gentle Glue. I'm just putting a little bit on and I'm hitting it with a hot dry iron, but any fabric glue, any basting glue should work for this. I recommend the glue over pinning or clipping. The other thing that I use is the Acorn Easy Press Pen. This is just a pen that holds starch liquid in it, and when you open it up, you can push this nib in. It gets the nib wet, and then you can draw a bit of starch onto the specific spot of the fabric that you actually want to starch. This is game changer. I know a lot of people that make their own version of this with just a water pen, or they buy this and when the solution runs out, they fill it with their starch of their choice. Whatever works for you. The nice thing about this is I'm able to add starch to just the seam, so that's cool. And then, of course, I need a hot dry iron. Not going to use any steam or anything. And I like to use a clapper because you're going to see on the back side of this, we're pressing all of our seams open, but we're doing lots of layers of fabric, you guys. So there's going to be lots and lots of bulk, and this clapper and the Acorn Easy Press Pen is going to get this to lay super flat. Like, it's thick, but there's no bumps. It's nice. So these two things are going to give me that nice flat seam, and this is going to keep the fabric where I want it to be until I get a chance to sew it. And so what I'm doing right now are building out a bunch of these little foundation squares so that I can sew them together and have my entire foundation built and then go in and colorize it. So let me show you how I'm doing that. For each one of these squares, I need 4 background squares, and then I need another 8 of those same size squares, but those 8 will be folded on the diagonal. So you can kind of see they're folded on that 45-degree angle. I'm going to need 2 for each one of those background squares. And I just need a hot iron and a little bit of glue to hold these together. What I like to do is baste these triangle pieces to the foundation square. And I use a little bit of fabric glue to do that. I feel like that just holds it in place a little bit better. You could use pins or maybe a basting stitch, whatever works for you, but this is my preferred method. And so I kind of do one at a time. I put 4 bits of glue in each of the corners. You just saw me do that there. And then I'll take the 2 folded triangle pieces and I'm going to lay them on top of that foundation square so that that fold is really butted up nice against each other and it's starting in one corner and ending in the other. And then once I'm happy with the position of those 2 triangles, I'm just going to put a little bit of heat on here that'll dry up the glue and help it adhere to the fabric. And then I'll set that aside. I'm going to repeat that for the other 3 squares that I have because I will need 4 of those units to make one of these, which is just honestly sewn together like a 4-patch with the seams pressed open. So let's kick this into caffeinated mode. I'll speed up the footage and we'll get these other 3 squares all prepped so we can sew them together. Now that I have 4 of these all glued and basted and ready to go, we're going to turn this into a 4-patch. And the most important thing here is that we're kind of making this diamond shape in the middle. And so we're just going to want to arrange our 4 pieces of fabric so that we're building out what that diamond would look like. And then we're going to take this to our sewing machine. We're going to sew here and here, press those seams open, and then we'll sew along here and press that seam open. When you bring these over to the sewing machine, just make sure you're being very delicate with your fabric so that you don't mess up anything you may have glued down. But I also like to make sure that when I'm lining these up, if I peel back one of the layers, that seam in the middle where those 2 pieces of folds are kind of matching up, it continues. I want to make sure that that valley where the 2 folded fabrics are matching up is laying almost right on top of one another. Because this is something that I'm going to be playing with a lot, I am going to back stitch at the start and end of every one of my seams, just so I don't have to worry about it falling apart later. The next step is to press these open, and there is a lot of bulk here because we've got lots of layers of fabric, and that's where my Acorn Easy Press Pen and a clapper come into play for me. I'm going to open this up and lay it so that the pretty side or the right side is down, and then I'm going to find the center of that seam, and I'll know I found it when I can see kind of like the little triangle bits at the intersection kind of come out to play, so to speak. I'm going to finger press it down, and then I'm going to grab my Acorn Easy Press Pen. I'm just going to draw a line of starch on that, and then I'm going to put a hot dry iron right on top of it. I'm going to let that heat up and evaporate the starch. It's going to make that seam flat, and once I'm done with that, then my clapper is going to come in and lay on top of the seam and help it cool in that ultra flat position. That's how I'm going to get these really flat seams, even though I've got tons of bulk going on there. Once I have my top and bottom row sewn together, then I just need to marry them up. And I want to show this to you because you would think that the most important thing is this intersection lining up, but it's actually not, because that's where our pop of color is going to come in. It's going to cover this up. What's most important is that the 4 points actually match up as best as possible. So what I like to do is put these together, right sides together, and then I'm going to peel back this corner and make sure that I am continuing that line. And if I am, I'll grab a clip, put that there, and then over here on this side, I'm going to do the same thing. Make sure I'm continuing that line. And if I am, I will put a clip there. And then If I wanted to, I could come in and finagle this to be dead center, but as long as those end points are matched up, we're okay. I'm just going to put a clip here to hold this just so I don't have to worry about it with my hands. Then we'll go to our sewing machine and we're going to stitch this together, making sure to back tack at the start and the end of that seam. Just like we did with the other seam, we're going to press this open. But before I do, I'm going to open this up and I'm going to make sure that all of my points are relatively lined up. If it's off by a couple of threads, you're going to be okay, just because you're going to end up folding this fabric down, and you'll see what I mean when we get further into this video. But if you're off by an 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 of an inch, I would go back and fix that. So let's lay this right side down. We'll find the center of that seam. It does take a little bit of finagling, lots of bulk going on here. I'm going to press it nice with my fingers, grab my starch pen, and then a hot iron. I'm just going to let it sit right on top of that seam, get it nice and hot. And then the clapper will come in and help it cool it down in an ultra flat position. And this is the foundation square that we're going to build out. We're going to make a bunch of these to build out a foundation piece that is the size of the quilt that I want to make. In this case, I am aiming for something that'll be around 18 inches by 24-ish inches. So I've got several of these to do. Each of my rows in this project are going to be 5 across. So once I have 5 of those 4 patches made, I'm going to sew them together into a row and then attach it to my ever-growing foundation, just so I can keep everything nice and tidy. And to do that, we are going to need some pins. By the way, this pin cup is amazing because it's magnetic. Check that out, nothing spilling out. And then you can take it apart, just like this, flip this around, and bada bing, bada boom, you have a little travel container to take your pins with you wherever you go. I'll link to this in the description box down below. You can get this from Purple Hobbies, and I do have a coupon code for you that'll get you 20% off. Anyway, back to the tutorial. What I'm going to do is grab these squares, and I want to make sure that these points are lined up. As you'll notice in this row, the most important thing is that the points on the sides and the tops are all kind of touching one another. We don't care too much about this area. And so that means when we put the rows together, we're not going to care too much about this. We're going to care mostly where those points are. So let's start by focusing on these points. When I sew 2 together, I'm going to grab a pin. On the wrong side of one of my 4 patches, I'm going to pop a pin in through the back, and that pin, when it comes up through the front, should come in right at the very point that those 2 folded fabrics kind of meet at. And then I'm going to line it up with the next one. I'm going to put the pin through the very top of the point on the right side, letting it come out through the back. And once that's done, I'll just kind of stack this up nice and neat. And I want to let this pin hang down nice and straight. And then I'll put 1 clip on either side of that pin to hold it in place. And then I'm just going to take that out. I'm not using the pin to hold it. I'm just using the pin to line up the points, very similar to how you might do it in foundation paper piecing. Now we're going to go stitch this. Just like we did before, we're going to back stitch at the start and end of our seam. Once I get close to the first clip, I'll just pop it off. Now, as I'm going through here, you can't see it on camera, but because I've pressed open, I can see this little intersection, this little V where my point is. I just want to stay maybe a thread to the right of that point. Once I've sewn that together, I'll open it up and I'm going to inspect these 2 points. I want them to come close together. I don't want them chopped off. If there's a little bit of space, just a couple threads, that's okay. The most important thing is that they are lined up. I want them to be even. If that's good, then I'll flip this over and just finger press. I'm not going to worry about doing a heat press or a starch press with this just yet. I'll do it once the whole row is done, just to save myself a little bit of time. I'm going to finger press this seam open, and then I'll grab the next square and just repeat the process until this whole roll is built out. Did I say roll? I meant row. Once my row's built out, then I'm going to come in with my acorn pen, my iron, and my clapper and get all of these to lay super flat. Once we have a row sewn together, we're going to follow that same process to secure this new row to our ever-growing foundation. We're just going to pin multiple points instead of just the one. So I'm going to put these right sides together. And then on the back side of one of the rows, I'll pop a pin right at the top of that point, and then I'll put it through the top of the other point. And I'm going to do that all along before I put my clips in. Once all of my pins are in, I'm going to let them hang straight just like I did before. And then I'll put one clip on either side of each pin to hold it in place for me. And now we're going to go along this whole edge and stitch this down very carefully. There's quite a bit of bulk here, and the project kind of want to shifts on its own, so just be delicate when you're doing this, and everything should, hopefully, knock on wood, come out okay. If you're nervous about this, you can always go through it the first time with a basting stitch. Make sure everything lines up to your satisfaction, and then stitch back over it with a tighter stitch length. Before I bother trying to press that whole thing open, I'm going to open it up and make sure my points are where I want them to be. I'm going to look at each area, and that looks pretty good for me. So you can kind of see now I'm starting to get this secondary cathedral window pattern. So what that's going to allow me to do is, as I'm building this out, I'm not just going to have rows of color. I'm going to have color here, 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 here. Like all of this is going to be color. There's going to be lots of movement in this because it's going to kind of go all over the place. And then once my entire foundation piece is built out and I'm auditioning my fabrics, my color placements, I'll be able to decide if I want color to even be around the edge or if I want that to kind of just be a nice border and I just want to fold this up and let that stay white. Not sure what I'm going to do yet. We'll figure it out when we get there. All right, let me finish making the foundation so that I can actually put some color onto this. I have the foundation for my cathedral window quilt all pieced together, and boy, was that a lot of work. Literally, this probably took me about a week to make. This takes a lot of fabric, a lot of patience, and a lot of time. But it's done, and it's ready for the next step, which is to turn all of these little diamonds into something that looks like this. And I can't wait to see how it comes together. To do that, I'm going to use this pile of batik scraps. Most of these are scraps that were left over from the panda quilt that I made for my friend Mary. I used the pandas and sweaters pattern from Elizabeth Hartman, and she pulled a fat quarter bundle off of my shelf to represent the sweaters in that quilt. So I thought this would be really cool because I loved those fabrics, and once those are into the quilt, I kind of will have a little memento of the quilt that I made for her. So the first thing I have to figure out is how big am I going to cut the little squares that are going to go into this quilt? Well, for me, what I have learned is if I cut it about 1/4 inch smaller than the square that I made for the background, I'm usually pretty golden. So since all of these squares were cut at 2 inches, I'm going to cut a whole bunch of 1 3/4 inch squares. So let me show you what that might look like. I'm going to grab this green. I'm going to cut a 1 3/4 inch square. And then I just have to find the place where I want to put this. I haven't really laid out all of my squares yet, so I'm not quite sure if this is where I want it to end up. I need to cut one of these squares for every single one of these diamonds that I see, and then if I want it to also be along the edges, I'll need a square for over there too that we'll end up trimming off when we square all this up and put our binding on. I don't want to permanently attach it to the quilt yet because the quilting is going to happen after all of the squares are laid out, and I'm going to take the time to put my batting and my backing on here, and I'll come in and quilt it all at once. But I do want to start basting the squares into position. Now that I have my foundational piece together, I took the time to cut out all of my little squares of color and audition them on my quilt top, and I was really happy with the placement. I wanted to go with an ombre type of feel. So I took blues and kind of started blending them into the purple. Really, really happy with this layout. I've started working on gluing things down, but I want to take a moment to show you what I'm doing. First, every one of these squares is glue basted to the foundation. Second, you'll notice along the edges over here, I have some squares that are kind of hanging off, but that's not the case over here. These actually aren't raw edges. Maybe I could have cut them on the diagonal, but I'm not entirely sure how I'm going to finish the quilt, so I just folded them in case this ends up needing to be exposed when the quilt is all quilted and faced or bound. I'm not sure which I'm going to do yet. So here's what I'm doing for the edge pieces. I'm taking one of these squares and I am folding it in half on top of itself. And then I'm just taking a drop of glue. I'm using so much glue in this project, it's not even funny. And then I'll just kind of hold that there for a second, grab a hot iron, and that's going to cause the glue to dry and really hold that fabric in place for me. This is, as I mentioned, the Acorn Precision Piecing product, so it's fabric glue. It's just meant to hold temporarily. It's just a basting glue. So I'm going to do that to all of the squares around the sides. When I get to the corner unit, I'm going to do something just a little bit different. Obviously, I can't fold it on itself like this because that's not going to do what I need it to do. So I'm going to fold it in once on one side and then up over on the other side to kind of make like a quarter square triangle unit. And what I'm going to pay attention to is right here, this fold. I want the folds to lay on top of one another. I'm going to try to get it so that if I were to pull this piece down and curve it over, it's going to cover up that whole raw edge that's right there. Once I've got it where I want it to be, I'll just put a couple drops of glue in here, lay the fabric on top of itself, and then give that a bit of heat. Now, if I have one where I had to lift it off of the foundation and I removed the glue that was behind it before, since this is just a basting glue, we'll just re-glue it back in place. I've had to do that on a few of them. Once I have them all kind of pressed down, then we'll grab our heat and get everything to melt in there really nice. Let me flip this around because I've already started to curve in the pieces. This is what you're going to get when the cathedral window is all kind of quilted and put together. It's going to make this design over the whole quilt. I love the way this looks. So let me show you in detail what I'm doing to prepare this piece. Now, this is not stitched down yet. This is just glued. So what I'm doing is I'm picking up one of these edges and I'm going to draw a line of glue right along that fold of that white piece of fabric, and then I'll take a stiletto or some other instrument that I can use to get up under that fabric and fold it over so that it's on top of the color. And then I find if I just kind of hold it in place for a couple of seconds, the glue starts to secure, and that gives me enough time to start working on the next section. Before I move on to anything else, I'm going to get its counterpart right here and fold this over. I'm going to test it first with my hand because I want to make sure that this point is nice and tidy. And there might be some times where when you fold this one over, you realize that really maybe what should have happened to keep this point nice and tidy is that this should have been on top. And at that point, I'll just kind of lift it up and tuck the other one under. In this case, this one's laying on top quite nicely. What I'm looking for, and I don't know if you can see this in the camera, but what I'm looking for is that when I pull this flap down, I'm kind of keeping this fold right on top of the point. I don't want it to come all the way over like this. I want it to just be a very nice, gentle curve. I don't know if I'm explaining myself well, but that's the beauty of video, is you can see what I'm doing instead of just hearing what I'm talking about. You might have better words to explain what I'm trying to tell you than I do. We'll put my glue on there. I'm going to press this one down, and now I'm going to hold this with my stiletto while I curve the rest of the piece. I'm just going to hold that in place for a moment, and then once I'm satisfied with how that looks, I'll set it with the iron. And if the fabric, like it is down here, is still lifting up, it might be because I didn't get glue in that one spot. It's going to be most important that it's glued on the ends so that it doesn't lift up while you're quilting. But I'm probably overdoing it because I'm trying to make sure the entire thing is glued down. I'd rather be safe than sorry. What should be happening as we're building this out is where all of these points come in, this should create almost a perfect cross. If you're off by a couple of threads, it's gonna happen, but I would try to not make these points off by more than just a couple threads. It's been a minute since I've worked on this. I got all of my flaps folded over and glue basted down, and now it's time to get to the quilting, but I actually have been paralyzed at this step because I'm terrified that my quilting isn't going to look good and it's going to ruin the quilt. And I've put so much work and so much time into this project just getting to this point that if the quilting didn't look good, I was afraid I was going to ruin my project. So here's what I did to overcome that. First of all, I just gave myself a little bit of grace to try, and I tried on a sample piece. So I made a smaller cathedral window just with a few pieces that would allow me to practice quilting around these curves so that I could kind of get that muscle memory down. Second, I used a thread that actually blends right in with this white fabric. That is game changer because all I'm doing is adding the texture and it's not taking your eye away from these pops of color or the shape. Like, honestly, right now, you probably can't even tell that that's stitched. And in person, I know it is, but my eye is not going to the stitching right now. So that means if I'm a little off or not absolutely perfect on any of these future curves, it's not going to ruin my quilt. I'm gonna be okay. Now, there's a couple of ways that you can quilt this. You can, of course, do it by machine, which is what I'm going to do, or you can do it by hand. I know a lot of people will go in and just sew down this flap to the pieces underneath. That's not what I'm doing because I don't hand sew. I know without a doubt that my machine quilting will look better than my hand quilting. Before I take this over to the machine and show you what my stitching will look like, I do want to show you the back. This was an excellent find and I am really tickled about it. It's a blue batik, which you can see kind of matches nicely with the front of the fabric, but it's got this cathedral window print on the back too. I'm so excited about it. The other thing I want to tell you I did that's going to make this a lot easier, not only did I glue baste down all of these little flaps, but when I made my quilt sandwich, I used some spray basting to hold all three of these layers together. So I've got the back, the batting, and the quilt top all assembled here with a generous amount of spray baste. And then to make sure that that spray basting is holding everything nice and secure, I did press it with a hot iron on a high heat to melt all of that down. So this is not going anywhere. When I take it to the machine though, I do want to make sure that I have an extending table, or my machine can be recessed down into a cabinet or something, so that the weight of this is even with the feed dogs of my machine, which is going to help kind of reduce the drag and pull on the quilt top. All right, let's go over to the machine and get this quilted. You guys, quilting this beast is the whole reason why I said at the beginning of this video, this is not a beginner-friendly project, but it is possible. There's a couple of tips and tricks that I'm going to give you that might help you succeed. The first one is going to be patient and kind with yourself, because this is going to take a lot of time and a lot of practice. Second one is, speaking of practice, make yourself a practice swatch so that you can practice quilting those curves and get that muscle memory down before you do your actual piece. Once it's time to do your big piece, couple of tips. First one, use a thread that blends in with that concave shape. For me, it's the white. So I used, I think it was 6722 Aurifil thread. It's kind of a cream color, but it blends in perfectly on the white background. When I started quilting this, I wanted to make sure that I was using a presser foot that lined up with that folded concave shape, the outer part of the curve, while keeping the needle on top of the background. So I wanted the stitching to be as close to that fold as possible without going over. For me, I'm using the default foot that came with my Singer 301, but if you have a more modern machine, maybe using something like your zipper foot might get you better results. I did find that lining up the right side of my foot with that outer shape, that outer curve, got me better results, and so I'm always trying to do that. As I'm finishing up one curve, I've already got my eyes locked in on the next curve that I'm going to do, and I'm trying to find a path that's going to let me navigate around the quilt top while always keeping the right side of my foot lined up with that curve. Now, there are going to be times where you can't get the right side of your foot lined up, and you have a choice. You can either use the left side of your foot to do a different curve, or if there's no escape path because everything around you is quilted, or you really don't want to use the other side of your foot, you can backstitch, tie off, cut your thread, and start again somewhere else. I'm going to tell you, I did that a number of times. In the beginning, when I first sat down and started quilting this, I literally could only do a few curves at a time, and then I had to take a break. So give yourself plenty of time and opportunity to get up and walk away from your machine. Because if you sit down and try and do this all in one stint, one quilting episode, if you've not done this, and this is not a muscle memory that you are familiar with, you're going to get frustrated. Take that off the table. You don't need this to be stressful. The last thing I'm going to say here is your stitches at first might not look great. If you're taking my advice to use a thread that blends in with your fabric, don't worry about it. The stitching is not going to draw the eye when this is all come together. Right now, your eye might go to those stitches because they're kind of the only ones there, and they pop out like a sore thumb. But once you've quilted the entire thing, what you're going to see is the texture of those cathedral windows, the pops of color, and the shapes, those nice curved shapes. So give yourself a little bit of grace to just breathe, take those breaks, and use your blender thread. When I started this, I was not giving myself that room to breathe and be okay. And I definitely ripped out stitches several times. So learn from my mistake. Wow, that was a long video, wasn't it? I know. There was so much information that I wanted to make sure got in the tutorial so that if you did want to try this, you could understand every step I took and kind of why I took that step. Since you stuck around for the whole thing, let me tell you a little secret. This quilt was made for a purpose, not just because it was on my bucket list. You see, Sean from The Guy Who Sews lives in the state of Virginia too, and every year he enters a quilt into the doll quilt category for the Virginia State Fair. This year, 2024, we decided to have a little friendly competition between ourselves. We are each going to make a quilt to submit into the doll quilt category and see how they do. Well, this quilt is my submission. I'm not going to spill the tea on what his quilt is, but I will link to his channel in the description box down below so that you can pop over there and you can see what his submission looks like. And if you're in Virginia and you happen to go to the State Fair for 2024, you can see these quilts in person. Thanks, friends, so much for checking out the video. Leave me a comment down below. Let me know what you thought of my quilt submission, and I'll see you guys all in the next video. Bye!